She had a ranch to run, a father's legacy to protect, and no time for strangers. But when she saw the man's hollow eyes and the little girl shivering beside him, she knew the day would not go as planned. The question was whether her kindness would be a blessing or the biggest mistake of her life. The wind in Redemption Gap, Colorado, had a mean streak. It came down from the San Juan Mountains with a high, lonesome sound, carrying the grit of the trail and the promise of an early winter. It rattled the windows of the general store and kicked up dust devils in the middle of the main street. Most folks hurried through their business, heads down, collars up. But Abigail Hayes met the wind head-on. She stood tall, her father's worn hat pulled low on her brow, her hands resting on her hips. She was not a woman who hurried for anyone, not even the weather. Her wagon was loaded with the month's necessities, sacks of flour and cornmeal, tins of coffee, a small barrel of salted pork. Her list was nearly complete, but she needed nails and a new length of rope for the well. She tied the reins of her steady old horse, Bess, to the hitching post and took the 3 steps up to the wooden porch of Abernathy's Mercantile. That's when she saw them, a man and a little girl, standing just off the porch as if the ground there was all they could claim. The man was thin, not just lean from work, but worn down to bone and sinew. His coat was threadbare at the elbows, his boots cracked and separating from his soles. He stared at the store's front window, at the pyramids of canned peaches and smoked hams, with a look of quiet desperation that Abigail knew all too well. It was the look of a man who had run out of road. Beside him, a small girl, no older than 7, clutched his pant leg. Her hair was the color of straw, and her face was pale with a smudge of dirt on one cheek. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from the kind of deep weariness a child should never know. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were just wide and empty, fixed on the same window as her father's. The store door creaked open, and Mr. Abernathy, a man whose smile was as tight as his wallet, stepped out onto the porch. He held a broom, though his purpose was not to sweep. "I told you, Dawson," Abernathy said, his voice sharp and loud enough for half the town to hear. "The slate's full. I'm not a charity." The man Dawson didn't flinch. He simply gave a slow nod, his shoulders slumping just enough for Abigail to see the weight he carried. "I know, Mr. Abernathy. I just thought, maybe a little work? I can stack crates, sweep up, anything. Got a boy for that." "He works for pennies," Abernathy scoffed, turning his back on them. "Now move along. You're making my paying customers uneasy." With that, he disappeared back inside, the bell above the door giving a final, mocking jingle. The man stood frozen for a moment. He looked down at his little girl, and the shame that washed over his face was so profound it made Abigail's chest ache. He placed a hand on his daughter's head, a gesture of comfort. He clearly did not feel himself. He had come here for help and had been met with scorn. Now, he had to lead his child away with nothing but an empty stomach and a heavier heart. He took her small hand and turned to walk away, his steps slow and defeated. Abigail had seen enough. She was not a meddler by nature. Her father had taught her to mind her own fences and let others mind theirs. But he had also taught her that there were times when a fence needed to be crossed, and a person's dignity was more important than a town's opinion. She stepped down from the porch, her boots making a solid, determined sound on the packed earth. "Hold up there," she called out. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the whine of the wind. The man stopped but didn't turn around, as if he expected another rebuke. His daughter, however, looked back at Abigail, her blue eyes wide with a flicker of something that might have been curiosity or maybe just surprise that anyone was speaking to them. Abigail walked closer, stopping a few feet away. She looked directly at the man's back. "That storekeeper, he doesn't speak for everyone in this town." The man turned slowly. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, like a sky threatening snow. He looked tired, but there was a guarded pride in his gaze. "It doesn't matter who he speaks for. The result is the same." "Maybe not," Abigail said. She gestured with her chin toward her loaded wagon. "I've got supplies. More than enough for one person." She looked from him to the little girl, whose gaze was now fixed on her. "Looks to me like you've got an empty table tonight." He stiffened, a flicker of resentment in his eyes. We're not looking for handouts, ma'am. Abigail met his gaze without blinking. She understood his pride. It was the last thing a man had when everything else was gone. I'm not offering one, she said, her tone softening just a fraction. I'm offering supper. There's a difference. She paused, then made her decision. It felt as sudden and as right as a summer rain. Come with me. I'll fill your table tonight. He stared at her, suspicion warring with a desperate need. He glanced around the street, at the faces and windows who had watched his humiliation. He looked at the hard-faced men leaning against the saloon wall, then back at Abigail. She stood apart from all of it, a solitary figure of quiet strength. Her face was weathered by the sun and wind. Her hands were calloused, and her eyes held no pity, only a straightforward purpose. You don't know me, he said, his voice a low rasp. I know what it looks like when a child is hungry, Abigail replied simply. She looked at the little girl and offered a small, hesitant smile. And I know there's a pot of beans on my stove that's big enough for 3. The little girl, Clara, took a small step forward, her grip on her father's hand tightening. It was a small movement, but it was enough. The man's resolve seemed to crumble. The fight went out of his shoulders. He looked down at his daughter, then back at Abigail. The silent question in his eyes was one she had seen before. Can I trust you? Abigail just nodded, as if the deal was already struck. My ranch is a few miles out of town. It's warm there, and the wind doesn't bite so hard. You can follow behind in my wagon. She turned without waiting for another argument, walking back to her horse. The man, Samuel Dawson, watched her go. He watched as she untied the reins with capable hands and checked the knots on the ropes securing her supplies. She moved with an economy of motion, a woman who knew her own mind and her own strength. He looked at Clara, at her pale face and hopeful eyes, and knew he had no other choice. It was one thing for him to go hungry. It was another for her, too. Come on, sweetheart, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He lifted her into his arms. She felt impossibly light. He walked toward the wagon and stopped beside it. Abigail looked at him from the driver's seat. You can set her up here beside me. There's an old blanket behind the seat she can wrap up in. He hesitated for only a second before lifting his daughter onto the seat. Abigail reached behind her and pulled out a thick, clean wool blanket, wrapping it around the child's small frame. Clara burrowed into it, her eyes closing almost immediately, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. Thank you, Sam said, the words feeling small and inadequate. Save your thanks for after you've eaten, Abigail said, flicking the reins. A full belly makes everything seem better. The wagon creaked as it pulled away from the town, leaving the dust and the judging eyes behind. The ride was silent, filled only with the rhythmic clopping of Bess's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. Sam walked beside the wagon, his hand resting on the wooden side, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't know who this woman was or what she truly wanted, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something he had almost forgotten. It was the faint, fragile light of hope. Abigail didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the road, a path she knew as well as her own reflection. Her father had carved this ranch out of nothing, and she had held it together after he was gone. It was a hard life, a lonely one. She'd learned to be self-reliant, to trust her own judgment and little else. Bringing these strangers home went against every rule she lived by. But as she glanced at the sleeping child nestled beside her, breathing evenly for what was probably the first time all day, Abigail felt a quiet settling in her heart. Maybe just this once she had done the right thing. The land ahead was vast and unforgiving, but her small cabin, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods by the creek, was a sanctuary. Tonight, at least, it would be a sanctuary for 3. The track to Abigail's homestead was little more than 2 ruts carved into the earth, winding away from the main road toward a gentle rise of land. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of orange and pale purple. The air grew colder, sharper. Sam pulled his thin coat tighter, his long strides easily keeping pace with the wagon. He watched the landscape, the way the grasslands gave way to scattered pines and rocky outcrops. It was rugged country, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. He studied the woman beside him when she wasn't looking. She handled the horse with an easy confidence, her hands firm but gentle on the reins. She seemed a part of this land, as sturdy and resilient as the old juniper trees that dotted the hillsides. She hadn't asked him a single question about who he was or where he came from, an omission that was both a relief and a source of unease. Charity often came with a price, and the price was usually a piece of your story. After what felt like an hour, they crested a low hill, and Abigail's place came into view. It was a small, well-built log cabin with a stone chimney that sent a thin curl of white smoke into the evening sky. A neat, sturdy fence enclosed a small yard, and a solid-looking barn stood a short distance away. Everything about the place spoke of hard work and pride. It was not a sprawling ranch, but a homestead built to last. "We're here," Abigail said, her first word since leaving town. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin's front porch. The horse, Bess, let out a low nicker, and a moment later, a scruffy-looking dog with one floppy ear trotted out from behind the cabin, its tail giving a few cautious wags. "That's Patches," Abigail said. "His bark is worse than his bite, and he rarely bothers to bark." The little girl, Clara, stirred at the sound of their voices, blinking awake. She looked around, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder as she took in the strange new place. "It's all right, sweetheart," Sam said, moving to the side of the wagon to help her down. "We're just visiting." Abigail swung down from the driver's seat with practiced ease. "You two go on inside." The doors unlatched. "I'll unhitch the horse and bring in the rest of the supplies." "I can help," Sam offered immediately. It was important to him that she knew he was not lazy. Abigail considered him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, take your girl inside first, get her warm. The fire's banked, just needs a log. Then you can give me a hand with the heavy sacks." Sam did as he was told, leading Clara by the hand up the 2 porch steps. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, and they stepped inside. The cabin was a single large room, but it was clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bed with a handmade quilt was tucked into a corner, and a simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A small cook stove was near the fireplace, and the air was filled with the faint, comforting smell of wood smoke and coffee. It was a humble home, but it was warm and safe. Clara clung to his side, looking at everything. Sam knelt beside her. "It's a nice place, isn't it?" he whispered. She gave a small, uncertain nod. Her eyes landed on a small, carved wooden bird sitting on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. "Go on and get warm by the fire," Sam urged her gently. He nudged the embers in the hearth with a poker, and they glowed to life. He added a small log from the stack beside it, and bright orange flames began to lick at the wood. Clara crept closer to the growing warmth, holding her small, cold hands out toward the fire. Sam watched her for a second, a pang of guilt twisting in his gut. He had let her down. He had brought her to this point, to where they had to rely on the mercy of a stranger. He pushed the feeling aside. There was no time for guilt now. There was only time for work. He stepped back outside into the fading light. Abigail was already unbuckling the harness from the horse. He moved to the other side and began to help, his hands finding the familiar buckles and straps. They worked in silence, a shared rhythm that needed no words. He knew his way around a horse. That much was clear. Once Bess was unhitched and led into the barn with a measure of oats, they turned their attention to the wagon. "I'll take the flour," Sam said, moving toward the heaviest sack. "It's 100 pounds, Abigail stated, not as a challenge, but as a fact. "I can manage," he said. He bent his knees, got a firm grip on the sack, and lifted it onto his shoulder. The weight was immense, and his tired muscles screamed in protest, but he straightened up, his jaw set. He would not show weakness. Not now. He carried it into the cabin and set it carefully in the small pantry area. When he came back out, Abigail was lifting the barrel of salted pork with a low grunt. It was a task that would have challenged most men, yet she handled it with a grim determination. Sam rushed forward. "Let me get that," he said. "I've got it," she replied through gritted teeth, but her footing slipped slightly on the uneven ground. Sam didn't ask again. He moved in, putting his shoulder next to hers, and together they lifted the barrel and carried it inside. For a moment, standing close in the cramped pantry, he could smell the clean scent of pine soap and the cold mountain air on her clothes. He stepped back quickly. They made several more trips, unloading the rest of the supplies until the wagon was empty. By the time they finished, the last light of day had vanished, and a brilliant canopy of stars was emerging in the clear, cold sky. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled cheerfully, and the room was filled with a warm, yellow glow from an oil lamp that Abigail had lit on the table. Clara had fallen asleep on a small rag rug in front of the hearth, the wool blanket tucked around her. Abigail moved to the cook stove. "I said there were beans," she said, her back to him as she lifted the lid off a heavy cast-iron pot. Steam billowed out, smelling of bacon and spices. "I also have fresh cornbread from this morning." She ladled the thick stew into 2 tin bowls and set them on the table alongside a slab of cornbread. She motioned for him to sit. "Eat. You've earned it." Sam sat down, his body aching with a weariness that went deeper than the day's labor. He looked at the steaming bowl in front of him. It had been days since he'd had a hot meal. It had been longer since his daughter had. He picked up the spoon, but his hand trembled slightly. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick. I don't know how I can repay you." Abigail sat across from him, her own bowl before her. She didn't start eating. She just watched him, her expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "Start by eating," she said quietly. "And my name is Abigail." "Not ma'am." She picked up her own spoon. "As for repayment, we can talk about that in the morning. A person can't think straight on an empty stomach." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He bowed his head for a moment, a silent prayer of gratitude, then began to eat. The stew was hot and rich, and he ate quickly, not realizing how ravenous he was until the first spoonful. It was the best meal he had ever tasted. He didn't stop until the bowl was clean. Abigail ate slowly, methodically. She watched him, but her gaze was not judgmental. It was assessing. She was taking his measure, and he knew it. When he was finished, he looked over at his daughter, sleeping peacefully by the fire, a sight that was more nourishing than any food. "She's a quiet little thing," Abigail commented. "Her name is Clara," Sam said. She's been through a lot. Her mother passed on the trail from Missouri. Fever took her just outside of Fort Laramie. He hadn't meant to share that, but the warmth of the cabin and the kindness of the meal had loosened something inside him. Abigail's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. It's hard country for a man alone. Harder still with a child." She looked toward the fire. "My folks are gone, too. Father built this place with his own 2 hands. Died 2 winters back when a tree he was felling kicked back on him. My mother passed years before that." The shared confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge of understanding. They were 2 solitary people, shaped by loss and the unforgiving nature of the land. "This is a fine place," Sam said, looking around the sturdy room. "Your father was a good builder. You've kept it up well." "It's all I have left of him," she said simply. She stood and took their empty bowls to a wash basin. "You can sleep there by the fire. It's the warmest spot. There are extra blankets in that chest in the corner. I'll take the cot." "No, I couldn't," he started to protest. "The floor is fine." "It's not a request," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My house, my rules. You and your girl take the warm spot. I won't have you falling ill on my account." She didn't wait for his reply. She laid out a simple cot for herself on the far side of the room, keeping a respectable distance. The unspoken boundary was clear. This was an act of charity, not of familiarity. Sam went to the chest and pulled out 2 thick wool blankets. He gently lifted Clara, who murmured in her sleep, and carried her to the spot by the fire. He laid one blanket down as a pallet and covered her with the other, tucking it snugly around her. He then sat down with his back against the warm stones of the fireplace, pulling his own thin coat around him. He was too proud to use the other blanket for himself. He intended to stay awake, to stand guard in this stranger's house. But the warmth of the fire, the weight of the food in his belly, and the bone-deep exhaustion pulled at him. His eyelids grew heavy. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was Abigail, sitting on her cot, cleaning a rifle with methodical, practiced movements. The lamplight caught the glint of the steel barrel, a silent reminder that her kindness did not make her a fool. She was a woman who was prepared for anything, and he and his daughter were still strangers under her roof. Please continue. I am aware that we are currently at approximately 3,550 words. Sam woke before the first hint of dawn. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange embers, casting a soft, warm light across the cabin. For a moment, he was disoriented, the unfamiliar weight of the silence pressing in on him. Then it all came back. The town, the storekeeper's cruel dismissal, the unexpected kindness of the woman sleeping soundly on the far side of the room. He looked over at Clara, still fast asleep, her small face peaceful in the firelight. A wave of fierce protectiveness washed over him. He would not fail her again. He rose silently, his joints stiff from the cold and the hard work of the previous day. He gently added another log to the fire, careful not to make a sound. The flames caught quickly, sending shadows dancing up the log walls. He saw the rifle Abigail had been cleaning, now leaning against the wall by her cot. It was a clear and constant reminder of his position here. He was on her land, under her roof, and entirely at her mercy. Mercy was not something he could afford to rely on for long. Dignity had to be earned. He pulled on his cracked boots, slipped out the cabin door as quietly as a shadow, and closed it gently behind him. The pre-dawn air was brutally cold, stinging his lungs and making his breath cloud in front of him. The stars were still scattered across the black sky like chips of ice. He looked around, taking in the layout of the homestead. His eyes fell on a large woodpile near the side of the barn and a chopping block with a heavy axe sunk into its surface. It was a clear and obvious need. A cabin in this country consumed firewood like a hungry beast. He pulled the axe free. It was heavy, well-balanced, and the blade was sharp. The woman, Abigail, took care of her tools. He swung it experimentally, the motion familiar and comforting. Back in Missouri, he'd cleared 20 acres of oak and hickory with an axe just like this one. He set a thick round of pine on the block and brought the axe down with a clean, satisfying thwack. The wood split perfectly in two. He set to work, the rhythmic fall of the axe the only sound in the vast, sleeping world. He worked not with frantic energy, but with a steady, relentless pace, losing himself in the physical labor. It was honest work. It was something he could offer. Inside, Abigail came awake not to the sound of the axe, but to the silence that followed it. She was a light sleeper, attuned to the noises of the ranch, the sigh of the wind, the call of a distant coyote, the creak of a floorboard. The rhythmic chopping had entered her dreams, and its absence was what woke her. She lay still for a moment, listening. The fire was crackling, which was a good sign. She sat up, her eyes immediately going to the hearth. The child was still asleep, a small mound under the blanket. But the man, Dawson, was gone. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Her first thought was of the horse. Had he stolen Bess and ridden off in the night? Her gaze shot to the rifle, still in its place. She threw off her blankets, her heart pounding. She pulled on her boots and her heavy sheepskin coat and grabbed the rifle, checking the load out of pure instinct. She didn't want trouble, but her father had taught her to always be ready for it. She pulled the door open a crack and peered out. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a pale gray line on the horizon. And then she saw him. He was not by the barn, not making for the road. He was standing by the woodpile, his back to her. He had already split a considerable pile of wood, stacked neatly against the cabin wall. He was not chopping anymore. He was simply standing there, rubbing his hands together to warm them, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of utter exhaustion. The fear in Abigail's chest receded, replaced by something more complicated. She watched him for a long moment. He hadn't been trying to wake her. He had been trying to work while she slept, to present his labor as a fact, not a request. It was a proud man's way of settling a debt. She lowered the rifle and leaned it against the inside of the doorframe before stepping out onto the porch. There was no need for that, she said, her voice quiet in the cold air. Sam startled, spinning around. He looked like a boy caught doing something he shouldn't, a flush of color rising on his cheeks. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't, she said, walking down the steps. She looked at the newly split wood. It was a morning's work, done in an hour. This is a good stack. But you've earned your breakfast already. You didn't have to work for it twice. It's the least I could do, he said, avoiding her eyes. He flexed his hands, which she now saw were raw and blistered. He didn't own a pair of work gloves. I mean to pay you back for your kindness. Abigail nodded, walking over to the woodpile. She picked up a piece of the split pine, testing its weight. Kindness doesn't put food on the table or keep the winter out, she said, more to herself than to him. She looked at him directly then, her gaze level. You said you wanted work. I have work. More than I can handle, if I'm being honest. His head came up, his gray eyes focused and alert. Anything. I can do anything. The north pasture fence is down in 3 places, she began, ticking the items off in her mind. Coyotes have been getting too bold. The barn roof has a leak in the west corner, and the first big snow will bring it down. And there's a section of land down by the creek that needs to be cleared of rock before the spring plow. My father always meant to get to it. She paused, letting the weight of the task settle between them. It's heavy work. Too much for one person. I'm not afraid of heavy work, Sam said, his voice ringing with sincerity. Good, she said, because I can't pay you in cash. I don't have it, but I can offer you a roof, food for you and your girl, and a piece of whatever this ranch produces. It's a fair trade. A look of profound relief washed over his face. It was more than he could have hoped for. It wasn't a handout. It was a position. It was a chance. That's more than fair, Abigail. Thank you. He said her name for the first time, and it felt right. Don't thank me yet, she cautioned, her practical nature reasserting itself. Let's see how you handle a post-hole digger first. Now come inside. I'm making coffee and oatmeal. Your girl will be waking soon. She turned and walked back to the cabin, leaving him standing by the woodpile. Sam watched her go, then looked down at his blistered hands. He didn't feel the sting. He felt the solid promise of a future, something he hadn't dared to imagine just yesterday. He gathered an armful of the wood he'd just split and followed her inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of brewing coffee. Clara was just beginning to stir, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. When she saw her father, her face broke into a small, sleepy smile. Good morning, sleepyhead, Sam said, his voice lighter than it had been in months. He knelt beside her and smoothed her tangled hair. Did you sleep well? She nodded, her eyes going to Abigail, who was moving about the stove. The woman was an intimidating presence, tall and capable, but she didn't seem mean. Abigail glanced over at the child. There's oatmeal, she said, her tone softer than before. With brown sugar, if you like it. Clara nodded shyly, clutching the blanket around her. Breakfast was a quiet affair. They ate at the small table, the silence broken only by the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. Clara ate every last bite of her oatmeal, her eyes bright with a child's simple pleasure in a sweet, warm meal. After they ate, Abigail handed Sam a small tin of salve. For your hands, she said gruffly. No sense in getting blisters on the first day. There's a pair of my father's old work gloves on a hook by the door. They'll be big, but they're better than nothing. The small gesture of concern was not lost on Sam. He applied the cool salve to his raw palms, the sting easing almost immediately. He pulled on the stiff leather gloves. They were indeed too large, but they were a shield. While Sam went out to fetch water from the well, Abigail turned her attention to Clara. The girl sat by the fire, watching her with those big, silent eyes. Abigail wasn't used to children. She didn't know the soft words or easy games that came naturally to other women. Do you know how to feed chickens? Abigail asked, her voice practical. Clara shook her head. Well, it's time you learned, Abigail said. Every hand has a job on a ranch, no matter how small. She took a small tin can of cracked corn and led the way outside to a small, secure coop behind the cabin. She showed Clara how to scatter the corn for the dozen or so hens, how to check the nesting boxes for eggs, and how to carry them carefully in a small basket. Clara was a quick learner, her movements careful and deliberate. As she reached into a nesting box and pulled out a smooth, warm brown egg, her face lit up with a genuine, brilliant smile. It transformed her, chasing away the shadows of weariness and want. "I found one," she whispered, holding it up as if it were a precious jewel. Abigail felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. "That's a good one," she said with a nod. "You've got a gentle touch. The hens like that." When Sam returned with 2 heavy buckets of water, he saw them coming from the chicken coop, Clara proudly carrying a small basket with 4 fresh eggs. She ran to him, her face alight. "Papa, look, I helped." He swung her up in his arms, his heart aching with love and relief. "I see that, sweetheart. You're a real ranch hand now." He looked at Abigail over Clara's head, a look of silent, profound gratitude in his eyes. She simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod before turning away to start the day's real work. They started on the north pasture fence. The autumn sun was bright, but gave little warmth against the persistent wind. Abigail worked with a silent, focused intensity that Sam found himself admiring. She knew exactly what needed to be done, digging new post holes with powerful economic movements, tamping the earth around the new posts until they stood firm and true. Sam followed her lead, clearing the old, rotted wood and stretching the new wire. He was a farmer, not a rancher, but he was a quick study. He learned to splice the wire, to drive the staples with 2 clean hammer blows. They didn't talk much. The work was the language between them. A nod to pass the hammer, a grunt to signal he was ready for her to pull the wire taut. Through their shared labor, a quiet respect began to grow. She saw that he was not just willing, but skilled. His hands, though soft from lack of recent work, were clever. He understood the logic of a well-built fence. He, in turn, saw the immense burden she had been carrying alone. The fence was in worse shape than she'd let on. This wasn't just a few down sections. It was a slow, creeping decay. The whole line needed replacing, a job for 2 men working for a week, not one woman with 1,000 other tasks. He saw the subtle lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the way she favored her left shoulder when she thought he wasn't looking. She was as tough as the weathered pine of the post she was setting, but even the strongest could break under enough strain. By midday, they had repaired the 3 worst sections. It was a solid morning's work. Abigail surveyed the new, tight line of wire, a look of satisfaction on her face. "It'll hold," she said, "for a while at least. We should replace the whole line come spring," Sam found himself saying. "Use cedar posts. They'll last longer." She looked at him, surprised by his use of "we." He hadn't meant to be presumptuous, but the word had felt natural. "Cedar's expensive," she said, her guard returning. "We could cut our own," he replied, gesturing to the distant, timbered hills. "It's more work, but it's cheaper than losing calves to coyotes." She didn't answer, but he could see her considering it. He had offered a solution, not just identified a problem. He was thinking about the future of this place. They walked back to the cabin for a midday meal of bread, cheese, and the eggs Clara had collected. The little girl had spent the morning on the porch, drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick, Patches the dog dozing at her feet. The sight of her, safe and occupied, settled a deep anxiety in Sam's soul. As they ate, Abigail seemed to wrestle with a thought. Finally, she looked at him. "You're from Missouri, you said." "That's right," Sam replied. "Had a small farm just south of Springfield. Corn and hogs." "What happened to it?" she asked, her question direct. Sam's jaw tightened. He had been expecting this. "The bank happened to it. My wife, Martha, when she got sick, I had to borrow for the doctor. And the crops failed 2 seasons straight. Not enough rain one year, too much the next. It was a hole I couldn't dig my way out of. When she passed, there was nothing left to hold me there. I sold what I could to pay off the worst of the debt and headed west with Clara. Thought we could start over in Oregon." He didn't tell her about the shame of the foreclosure, the cold looks of his neighbors, the feeling of being erased from the only home he'd ever known. He didn't need to. The story was common enough. Abigail just nodded, her eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table. "This land is mine, free and clear," she said, her voice low. "My father saw to that. He hated banks, said they were vultures in suits." She looked up, her gaze meeting his. "He also said you can't trust a man whose history you don't know." The implication was clear. She had taken a risk on him. A big one. "I have nothing to hide," Sam said, his voice steady. My story is short and not very interesting. I'm just a farmer who lost his farm, a husband who lost his wife. I'm just trying to give my daughter a chance at something better. That's all any of us are trying to do, Abigail said quietly. She stood, signaling the end of the meal and the conversation. The afternoon is getting on. Let's see about that barn roof before we lose the light. As Sam followed her out the door and toward the barn, he knew that a test had been passed. He had given her a piece of his past, and she had not thrown it back at him. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. It was the first post in a new fence he hoped, with all his heart, would be strong enough to hold. The barn was cavernous and smelled of hay, old leather, and livestock. High above, a single beam of afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes. It pinpointed the source of the leak, a dark, damp-looking patch on the roof sheathing where a few shingles had clearly been torn away by the wind. Well, there's your problem, Sam said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. I know where the problem is, Abigail retorted, her tone sharp. It's getting to it, that's the trick. The roof was high, and the pitch was steep. The ladder I have won't reach it from the outside. We'll have to get to it from the inside then, Sam said, already scanning the barn's massive timber frame. If I can get a plank across those two support beams, I can use it as a scaffold. Then it's just a matter of pushing out the rotten wood and fitting in a new piece. It was a good plan, but a dangerous one. A fall from that height would mean a broken neck. Abigail looked from the high beams to Sam. He was thin, but his work on the fence line had shown he was strong and sure-footed. I have some long, sturdy planks stacked behind the barn, she said, the decision made. Let's get them. Getting the heavy plank into position was a struggle. It took their combined strength, a good deal of grunting, and a long rope. Sam climbed the hayloft ladder and hauled on the rope, while Abigail guided the heavy board up from below. Finally, they wrestled it into place, a narrow wooden bridge 20 feet above the hard-packed dirt floor. I'll go up, Sam said, before she could volunteer. I'm lighter on my feet. He didn't say that he couldn't bear the thought of her taking the risk, but the sentiment was there, unspoken. Abigail didn't argue. She knew he was right. Be careful, she said, her voice tight with a concern that surprised her. If you fall, I don't have a wagon good enough to haul you to a doctor. It was her way of saying she was worried, cloaked in hard-headed practicality. Sam gave her a small, reassuring smile. I don't plan on falling. He shimmied up one of the thick support posts and swung himself onto the plank with a practiced agility. He tested it with his weight, then walked its length, his movements steady and confident. Abigail watched from below, her hand unconsciously gripping a nearby pitchfork, her knuckles white. She held her breath until he was safely across and braced against a rafter. She became his ground crew, sending up tools and shingles in a bucket tied to the rope. He worked methodically, prying away the rotten shingles and the soft, damp wood beneath them. Sawdust and splinters rained down. Clara, who had followed them to the barn, watched from a safe distance, her small face a mask of awe as she saw her father working so high above. Is Papa going to fly? She asked Abigail in a whisper. The question was so innocent it took Abigail by surprise. She looked down at the little girl, and a rare, genuine smile touched her lips. No, little one. He's just fixing a hole in the sky. The work took the rest of the afternoon. As Sam hammered the final shingle into place, the sun was setting, filling the barn with long, golden shafts of light. The leak was mended. He made his way back across the plank and down the post, dropping to the floor with a soft thud. He was covered in sawdust, and sweat streaked the grime on his face, but he was grinning. That should hold you through the winter, he said, wiping his brow with the back of his arm. It's a good patch, Abigail admitted, her voice filled with a grudging respect. You do good work, Dawson. Sam, he corrected her gently. My name is Sam. Sam, she repeated, testing the sound of it. Well, Sam, you've earned your supper 3 times over today. That evening, the mood in the cabin was different. The shared danger and the success of their hard work had forged a new kind of bond between them. An easy silence settled over the room, no longer heavy with suspicion, but comfortable with mutual weariness. After they ate, while Sam was whittling a small piece of scrap wood for Clara, Abigail did something she hadn't done in years. She took out her mother's old mending basket. She sat near the fire, the soft light illuminating her focused expression as she skillfully darned a tear in one of Sam's shirts. He had only two, and both were worn thin. Sam watched her, the rhythmic movement of the needle a soothing sight. He had missed this simple domesticity, the quiet companionship of an evening spent in shared, peaceful activity. He hadn't realized how lonely he had been until this very moment. Clara, her new wooden bird now in hand, eventually fell asleep by the fire. Sam gently carried her to her pallet, tucking the blanket around her. When he sat back down, Abigail was still sewing. Martha was good at that, he said quietly, his voice full of memory. She could make an old shirt look new. Set a stitch in time, save 9. Abigail didn't look up from her work. My mother used to say that, too. She tied off the thread and bit it clean with her teeth. She wasn't made for this country. She was a schoolteacher from back east. Gentle. She loved books and flowers more than cattle and dust. It was the most she had ever offered about her family. Sam remained silent, giving her the space to continue if she chose. My father brought her here, thinking it was a grand adventure, she went on, her voice soft and distant. But the loneliness wore on her. The wind never stops blowing, you know. After a while, the sound of it can get inside your head. She died when I was 12. I'm sorry, Sam said. And he was. He could see the ghost of that lonely 12-year-old girl and the self-sufficient, hard-edged woman before him. She folded the mended shirt and set it aside, finally looking at him. It was a long time ago. You learn to stand on your own. You have to. Her eyes flickered toward Clara. It's harder for a child, though. They need more than just a roof and a full belly. I know, Sam said, his throat tight. I worry about her all the time. I worry I'm not enough. She seems to think you are, Abigail said. The way she looks at you, it's like you hang the moon and the stars. She stood, her brief moment of vulnerability passing. I'm turning in. We got an early start tomorrow. Time to see about clearing that rock field. The days that followed fell into a steady rhythm. They rose before the sun, worked until dusk, and shared their meals in the quiet warmth of the cabin. Sam and Abigail worked on the rock field, a back-breaking task that involved pry bars, brute strength, and a stubborn refusal to quit. He would lever a half-buried rock out of the stubborn earth, and she would be there to help him roll it onto the stone boat, a simple sled pulled by the patient Bess. They cleared the land foot by painful foot. During the day, Clara became Abigail's shadow. She helped with the chickens, learned to churn butter, and knead bread dough with floury hands. Abigail, to her own surprise, found herself enjoying the child's presence. Clara's simple questions and easy laughter filled the silence that had long dominated the homestead. The cabin began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. One afternoon, while Sam and Abigail were taking a short rest by the creek, a rider appeared on the ridge. It was Jedediah Kane, a neighboring rancher from 5 miles down the valley. He was a widower in his 60s, with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. He was the closest thing Abigail had to a neighbor, and their relationship was one of wary respect. He trotted his horse down the slope and reined in a few yards away, his gaze taking in the scene. Abigail sitting with a strange man, a child playing by the water. Abigail, he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He nodded at Sam, his eyes lingering on him with open curiosity. Jed, Abigail replied, getting to her feet. What brings you out this way? Checking my fences. Heard you had some trouble with coyotes, he said, though his eyes told her he was here for another reason entirely. News of her leaving town with a stranger and his child would have spread like wildfire. Looks like you've hired some help. This is Sam Dawson, Abigail said, her tone neutral. He's working for his keep. Sam, this is Jed Kane. Sam stood and offered a polite nod. Mr. Kane. Kane didn't return the nod. He looked Sam up and down, from his worn boots to his mended shirt. Dawson, you say? Don't know any Dawsons in these parts. That's because I'm new to these parts, Sam said calmly, refusing to be intimidated. Kane grunted, then turned his attention back to Abigail, his expression softening slightly. Just want to make sure you're all right, girl. It ain't smart taking in strays. You don't know what kind of trouble they might bring with them. Abigail's spine stiffened. I appreciate the concern, Jed, but I'm a mistress of this ranch, and I decide who comes and goes. Sam's a hard worker, and he's earned his place here. The protective tone in her voice was unmistakable. It surprised Sam, and it clearly surprised Kane as well. The old rancher held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. All right, then. Just be careful. He tipped his hat. Ladies! He included Clara in the gesture, a flicker of kindness in his stern eyes. With that, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving a tense silence in his wake. He means well, Abigail said, staring after him. But he's a gossip. He's worried about you, Sam said. It's only natural. I don't need anyone to worry about me, she snapped, her defenses back in place. She turned and marched back toward the rock field. We're losing daylight, but the encounter had changed something. Kane's visit was a reminder that they were not an island. The world outside her fences was watching, judging. And in that world, a woman living with a man who was not her husband was a source of endless speculation. For the first time, Abigail was forced to confront the true nature of the arrangement she had made. It was a business deal, she told herself. A practical solution to a practical problem. But as she watched Sam lift another heavy stone, his muscles straining, his face set with determination, she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that was becoming something more. And she had no idea what to do about it. The weeks bled into one another, marked by the changing colors of the aspen trees on the high ridges and the deepening chill in the morning air. The rock field was cleared, the barn was sound, and a formidable woodpile, tall as a man, now stood beside the cabin. The homestead was ready for winter. Sam, Abigail, and Clara had settled into a life that felt as natural and as steady as the turning of the seasons. The physical space between Sam and Abigail in the small cabin had shrunk, replaced by a comfortable familiarity. He no longer felt like a stranger sleeping by her hearth. He was a partner in the endless work of the ranch. She no longer saw him as a stray she had taken in, but as a capable man whose presence had made her impossible burden manageable. She found herself listening for the sound of his axe in the morning, and the quiet evenings felt less empty with him sitting across from her, his hands busy with some small repair or a toy for his daughter. Clara was the glue that bound them. She would run between them as they worked, bringing them cups of water or presenting them with treasure she found, a smooth river stone, a brightly colored leaf, a fallen bird's feather. She had started calling Abigail Abby, a familiarity no one else would have dared. Abigail, who had never been soft, found herself softening for the child. She would stop her work to admire Clara's discoveries, and in the evenings, she began to read to her from one of her mother's old, cherished books of poetry. One crisp October evening, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall. They were large and wet, melting as they touched the ground, but they were a clear warning of the winter to come. Clara stood on the porch, her face turned up to the sky, trying to catch the flakes on her tongue. Laughter, pure and delighted, bubbled out of her. Sam and Abigail stood in the doorway, watching her. The sight of his daughter, so happy and healthy, filled Sam's heart with a warmth that had nothing to do with the cabin's fire. I haven't heard her laugh like that in a long time, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Abigail, her stern profile softened by the dim lantern light. That's because of you. You gave us a safe harbor, Abigail. More than that, you gave us a home. Abigail felt a blush creep up her neck. She was not used to such direct gratitude, such open emotion. You both worked for it, she said, her voice gruffer than she intended. This place is better for your hands being on it. But his words had unsettled her. Home. The word echoed in the quiet corners of her heart. She had thought of this place as a fortress, a legacy to be defended. She had never thought of it as a home for anyone but herself. Now, with this man and his child within its walls, the cabin felt more alive, more complete than it ever had when she was alone. The realization was as frightening as it was comforting. The next day, the snow was gone, but the cold remained. Abigail announced that she needed to go to town for the last of the winter supplies: salt, sugar, and lamp oil. "I'll come with you," Sam said immediately. "No," she said, more sharply than she meant to. "You stay here and finish splitting that last cord of wood. I'll be faster on my own. I'll take the wagon." The truth was, she needed the time alone. She needed the distance to think. Jed Kane's words had stayed with her, and the town's prying eyes would be on her. She needed to face them alone to reassert her independence. But as she hitched Bess to the wagon, Clara ran out of the cabin, her face anxious. "Are you leaving, Abby?" the little girl asked, her lower lip trembling slightly. Abigail's resolve faltered. She knelt, an awkward gesture for her. "Just for the day, Clara. I have to go to the store. I'll be back before supper. Can I come?" Clara whispered, her blue eyes pleading. Abigail looked from the child's worried face to the cold, empty horizon. She had never taken a child to town before. It seemed like a complication she didn't need. But the thought of Clara waiting here all day, worrying that she might not come back, was a thought she couldn't bear. "All right," she sighed, her voice surrendering. "But you have to stay close to me and no asking for candy." Clara's face broke into a radiant smile, and she threw her small arms around Abigail's neck in a spontaneous hug. Abigail froze for a second, then awkwardly patted the girl's back. The brief, warm contact sent a jolt through her. The trip to town was filled with Clara's endless questions about every rock, tree, and cloud. Abigail found herself answering patiently, pointing out a hawk circling high above and the tracks of a deer that had crossed the road. By the time they reached Redemption Gap, she felt strangely lighter. But the moment she pulled the wagon up to Abernathy's Mercantile, the familiar tension returned. Heads turned. Women paused in their conversations, their whispers following her like the dust kicked up by her boots. She lifted Clara down from the wagon, took the little girl's hand, and walked up the steps to the store with her head held high. Mr. Abernathy was behind the counter, and his eyes widened slightly when he saw them. His gaze flickered from Abigail to the child holding her hand, and a smug, knowing look crossed his face. Well, Abigail," he said, his voice oozing false pleasantry. "I see you've acquired a family. I see you're still selling overpriced goods, Abernathy." Abigail shot back, her voice like ice. "I need 20 pounds of salt, 10 of sugar, and 5 gallons of oil." She went about her shopping, ignoring the stares. Clara stuck close to her side, her small hand a warm anchor in a sea of cold curiosity. As Abigail was paying, the door opened and a man stepped in. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a handsome, smiling face and a confident air. It was Ben Carter, the son of the valley's wealthiest rancher. He had been trying to court Abigail, in his clumsy way, for the better part of the year. "Abigail," he boomed, his smile widening. "Good to see you in town." His eyes fell on Clara, and his smile faltered in confusion. "Who's this little one?" Before Abigail could answer, Abernathy cut in. "That's the child of her new hired man," the storekeeper said, emphasizing the last 2 words with a sneer. "The drifter she took in." Ben Carter's face darkened. He looked at Abigail, a mixture of jealousy and disapproval in his eyes. "A hired man? Living out at your place?" "Abigail, that's not proper. What will people say?" "I've never given a damn what people say, Ben, and I'm not about to start now," Abigail said, her voice dangerously low. She picked up her bags. "Come on, Clara." She turned to leave, but Carter stepped in front of her, blocking her way. "Now hold on. I've been worried about you out there all alone. Let me help you. Send this drifter on his way. My father and I can give you all the help you need." "I don't need your help," Abigail said, her patience gone. "And his name is Sam. He's a good man, a better man than many in this town who call themselves respectable." She tried to step around him, but he put a hand on her arm. "Don't be foolish, Abigail. Take your hand off me." The command was spoken without heat, but with the chilling finality of a closing door. Carter, startled by her tone, dropped his hand as if he'd been burned. Abigail pushed past him and walked out of the store, Clara scurrying to keep up. She loaded her supplies into the wagon, her hands trembling with fury. The injustice of it all, the town's judgment, Carter's possessiveness, Abernathy's malice. It was suffocating. She had always stood alone, and it had been hard, but it had been simple. Now, everything was complicated. Defending Sam had felt as natural as defending herself, and that realization shook her to her core. The ride home was silent. Clara seemed to sense her mood and didn't speak. As they crested the final hill and the homestead came into view, Abigail saw Sam waiting on the porch. He had seen the wagon coming and had walked out to meet them. The sight of him, solid and dependable, standing there waiting for them, made the anger drain away, replaced by a powerful, overwhelming feeling of coming home. He came to the wagon as she pulled it to a stop. He looked at her face and knew instantly that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. "Nothing," she said, avoiding his eyes as she began to unhitch the horse. "Just town gossip." He didn't press her. He simply took the harness from her hands and began to unbuckle it. "Let me do this," he said. He looked at Clara, who was watching them with wide, worried eyes. "Why don't you take Clara inside and get the stove going for supper?" Abigail nodded and took the child's hand. As they walked to the cabin, Clara looked up at her. "Abby," she said, her small voice serious. "That man in the store was mean." "Yes, he was," Abigail agreed. "Papa would have punched him," Clara stated with complete certainty. Abigail stopped and looked down at the little girl. A small smile touched her lips. "Yes," she said, "I believe he would have." That night, after Clara was asleep, Sam found Abigail sitting on the porch, staring out into the star-filled darkness. The wind was cold, but she didn't seem to notice. He came out with a blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up surprised. "You'll catch your death of cold out here," he said, sitting on the step below her. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the whisper of the wind and the distant call of an owl. "It was Ben Carter, wasn't it?" Sam finally asked. "And Abernathy." Abigail gave a slow nod. "They think you're a drifter. A charity case. They think I'm a fool for letting you stay." She paused, her voice dropping. "Carter thinks he has some claim on me. He offered to run you off." Sam's body went rigid. He turned to look at her, his face a hard mask in the moonlight. "What did you say?" "I told him you were a better man than any of them," she said simply. "I told him you'd earned your place." He stared at her, the force of her loyalty hitting him like a physical blow. He had known she was strong and capable. He had known she was fair, but he hadn't known the depth of her integrity. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles, Abigail," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's my battle, too," she replied, turning to meet his gaze. "This is my home. You are part of this home now, Sam. You and Clara. Anyone who speaks against you speaks against me." The confession, the final admission of what had grown between them, hung in the cold night air. The distance between them vanished, replaced by an intimacy so powerful it was almost dizzying. Sam reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "Abigail," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know what to say, how to put the gratitude and the deep, aching affection he felt for her into words. He didn't have to. She leaned forward, closing the small space between them, and kissed him. It was not a passionate kiss, but one of quiet certainty. It was hesitant at first, then firm, a declaration and a question all at once. It tasted of the cold night air, of wood smoke, and of a shared loneliness that was in that moment finally and completely erased. When they broke apart, they simply looked at each other, the truth of their feelings laid bare in the pale moonlight. This was no longer an arrangement of convenience. It was not about a debt owed or a wage earned. It was about two broken people who had, against all odds, found a way to mend each other. It was the beginning of all the rest. The winter was coming, but for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt the cold. They had a fire inside to keep them warm. Don't forget to subscribe and consider Super Chat. This supports us to continue telling new good stories like this. Thank you for watching. Before we wrap up, I just want to thank you for staying with me until the end. This channel exists because you're out there listening, feeling, and traveling through these stories with me. Your support is truly important to keep this channel alive, bringing more and more incredible tales filled with mystery, emotion, and inspiration. If you enjoyed what you heard today, consider supporting in some way by subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing this video with someone who also loves a good story. Every little gesture strengthens this project and gives me the motivation to keep creating new content. So once again, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next story.